Big data is used very extensively in the consumer space to take all of these different interactions that consumers have with brands and to find patterns in that data and to essentially, to put it cynically, sell better to those people. So the type of data that people are crunching in the consumer space are things like Visa that apparently can predict whether you're about to get divorced based on your spending patterns of those of your spouse.
But I think just to jump in there, that kind of takes it to a scary level that can be intimidating for a lot of people to think about.
No more visas.
No more visas. Or have you read the case about Target where they were talking about predicting pregnancy? But do you want to go back to the way that we kind of talked about it in terms of, I think the best way to think about what everyone's talking about when they talk about big data is really just understanding patterns. Instead of thinking about this as being a huge scope of plugging together everything in your digital life, it's really just looking at data, whether it be big or small, and finding patterns about people in a HR space.
And that's the thing about big data as well. It's increasing the consciousness that using data to support your decision making leads to better decisions. And so whether it's you're analysing sentiment from Twitter feeds or whether you're analysing Visa transactions and all this very complicated stuff that people are doing, the value for HR is realising that there is a lot of data that we already have within our systems, within our organisation, that can give you insights that we're not getting today.
So the first takeaway is size doesn't matter in this game. Big or small, it's about finding the patterns in the data. Whenever anyone says big data, they're usually using it as a term for basically finding patterns in data. But it doesn't really matter about scale here. Don't get caught in the technicalities. Do you want to jump into... I think the Moneyball analogy is a really good one.
Yeah, Moneyball's... has anyone seen the film Moneyball?
I've seen it, yes.
So whenever someone talks about data, particularly for HR, it's kind of a gimme. Someone wrote a book and then made a film about analytics and using data to support HR decision making. So you can't hear about analytics for HR without hearing about the Moneyball analogy, because it's a great one. So Moneyball essentially was about the Oakland A's in their 2002 season reinventing what success looked like for that organisation and then hiring to that profile of what meant success. So the common wisdom was that you want to put together a team of superstars. They could all hit home runs, they looked really good on the field, they were good for the marketing dollars. But when they analysed the data, what they actually found was that those things didn't matter so much as just getting onto the next base. However you did it, you could walk, you didn't have to hit a home run. The measures of success, what actually drove how many games that you won, was much simpler than that. And so 100 plus years of the way that they've been recruiting these people was wrong, essentially, or at least inefficient. So what they did was they realigned all of their talent acquisition strategies, is essentially what they were, and they found that they could get 3 players and pay them all $250,000 a year each. Still a pretty good salary, I would suggest. But that would get them the same results as one superstar player that they would pay $7 million a year. So in that way, they were able to compete. So they had a payroll budget of $32 million, I think it was, and they were able to compete effectively with teams like the Yankees, who had $100 million payrolls, so 3 times their payroll. And they did it essentially through data.
I mean, for me, one of the things that's really meaningful about using Moneyball as an example is that, to use the HR analogy, none of the day-to-day stuff really changes. You're still stepping up to the plate. You're still, hitting. You're still pitching. You're still throwing. In the same way that the day-to-day practice of what happens from a transactional HR perspective doesn't really change. Where this changes the game is at the strategic level. When you're planning for the future of the business, when you're dealing with the C-level, that's where this fundamentally changes the game. But in a day-to-day level, not so much. You're still doing the standard practices that people know and recognise as HR. that's kind of, I think, an important distinction to make.
I think what you do get though is the ability to find out where those practices are actually delivering value for your organisation as well. So to give you an example, does anyone here use psych assessments in recruiting within their organisations? Okay, so psych assessments are used to predict who's going to be a top performer once they become an employee and get into your organisation. But how many people have actually connected that predictive value to results once? One person. Right. Yeah. Psychologist studying for your PhD, so that's the one person who's done this. We've got all of this data available to us though. We have the results of the psych assessment, and then in the long term we know how well these people perform, how long they stay with the organisation, or whatever it is that's your measure of a successful candidate. But actually connecting those two can give you a great deal of value.
There will be so much more valuable data sitting within the organisation than outside the bounds of the organisation. That focusing efforts there, because it's just so much deeper in terms of that you have these longitudinal, the history of data where someone's contributing inside an organisation between a couple of hundred and a couple of thousand pieces of data a day. Potentially, and if you go external and look for these data points, you might get one or two. One of the really interesting things we can do is say, this is success. We're not going to tell you what success looks like. You give us your talent ratings. What is it in the way that people are behaving that is leading to that outcome? What are the patterns that are happening at 3, 6, 12 months prior, leading up to that review, that are different across your review levels? And I mean, in some of the cases, that can be as simple as having, we commonly see major difference in senior sponsorship. So you look across the people you're giving really high performance reviews to, the people you're seeing really low performance reviews to, and there's just a really big gap in how many people at a senior level in the organisation those people have access to. It's common sense, but when you quantify that and say that there's this 60% gap between those people, you can go out to the workforce and start talking about practical things that you can do to really push yourself potentially up those performance categories by building the links.